On October 16, 1946, at exactly 1:14 a.m., a trapdoor opened beneath a man's feet in a gymnasium in Nuremberg, Germany. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Nazi who had systematically starved an entire nation, fell through darkness for the last time. His neck didn't break cleanly. For 14 agonizing minutes, he struggled at the end of the rope while witnesses watched in silence. But here's what almost nobody knows. At the exact moment Arthur Seyss-Inquart was dying, his children were hiding in the Austrian mountains under assumed names, terrified that vengeful mobs would find them. His wife was in a psychiatric hospital, her mind shattered. And his grandchildren, who would later walk among us as ordinary citizens, hadn't even been born yet. This is the story of what happened to a family after their patriarch murdered 100,000 people. And it's far stranger than you could possibly imagine. The man before the monster. To understand what happened to Arthur Seyss-Inquart's family, you first need to understand who he was before history knew him as a mass murderer. Born in 1892 in Stone Brasov, Moravia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Arthur came from a respectable middle-class family. His father was a school teacher. Nothing in his childhood suggested he would one day orchestrate one of history's most efficient genocides. He was a serious student, disciplined. In World War I, he served with distinction in the Austro-Hungarian army, and during a mortar attack in 1917, shrapnel tore through his leg, leaving him with a permanent limp. For the rest of his life, he walked with a cane, a detail that would later seem almost theatrical, like a villain from a Gothic novel. After the war, he became a lawyer, a successful one. He married Gertrude Muska on July 14, 1916, a woman from a good Austrian family. They seemed perfectly ordinary. They had 3 children: Ingeborg, born in 1917, Richard, born in 1921, and Dorothea, born in 1928. In family photographs from the 1920s, Arthur Seyss-Inquart looks like any other respectable Viennese attorney. Serious, bespectacled, slightly austere. His children smile at the camera. There's nothing to suggest the abyss waiting just ahead. But here's what no one expected: the descent into darkness. In 1931, Arthur Seyss-Inquart joined the Austrian Nazi Party, not out of economic desperation or social marginalization. He was already successful. He chose this path. By 1938, he had become Austria's Minister of the Interior, and on March 11th of that year, he played a crucial role in engineering the Anschluss, Nazi Germany's annexation of Austria. Adolf Hitler rewarded him by making him governor of Austria. His wife Gertrude and their children suddenly found themselves living in the corridors of power. Think about this for a moment. Ingeborg was 21 years old. Richard was 17. Little Dorothea was just 10. What do you tell your children when your father becomes one of the most powerful men in a regime that would soon murder millions? But Arthur Seyss-Inquart's true infamy began on May 29, 1940. When Hitler appointed him Reichskommissar of the Netherlands, essentially the Nazi dictator of an occupied country of 9 million people. What happened next would shock everyone. Over the next 4 years, Seyss-Inquart systematically destroyed Dutch society. He implemented the Holocaust with ruthless efficiency. 107,000 Dutch Jews were deported to death camps. Of those, only 5,200 survived. That's a 95% mortality rate, one of the highest in Western Europe. But he didn't stop with the Jews. In the winter of 1944 to 45, he orchestrated what the Dutch call the Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter. He deliberately blocked food shipments to the Western Netherlands, using starvation as a weapon of control. More than 20,000 Dutch civilians starved to death. Children ate tulip bulbs to survive. The dead lay in the streets because people were too weak to bury them. One survivor later recalled, "We could hear them dying in the apartments around us. First the crying would stop, then the breathing, then silence." Arthur Seyss-Inquart did this, deliberately, methodically, with full knowledge of the consequences. The family in hiding. Now here's where the story gets complicated, and heartbreaking in ways you might not expect. While Arthur Seyss-Inquart was orchestrating mass murder in the Netherlands, his wife Gertrude was experiencing a psychological collapse. The exact timeline is unclear. Nazi families didn't publicize mental health crises, but by 1944, witnesses reported that she was barely functional. Imagine being married to a man who comes home from work where he's signed deportation orders for thousands of people. What does that do to your soul? What happens to your mind when you realize your husband is a monster, but he's still the father of your children? Meanwhile, their children were navigating an impossible situation. Ingeborg, the eldest, had married an Austrian officer in 1940. She had 2 children by 1945. Richard, the son, was serving in the German military, and young Dorothea, just 16 years old when the war ended, had grown up entirely within the Nazi system. When the war ended in May 1945, everything collapsed. Arthur Seyss-Inquart was arrested by Canadian forces on May 7, 1945. The Dutch wanted to execute him immediately. They had to be restrained. He was handed over to Allied authorities and taken to Nuremberg to face trial as one of the major war criminals. But here's what no one expected. His family didn't know if they would survive the next 24 hours. The reckoning, in the chaos of post-war Europe, being related to a major Nazi war criminal was often a death sentence, and not a legal one. In many occupied countries, angry mobs hunted down the families of collaborators and Nazi officials. Women had their heads shaved, children were beaten in the streets, some families were simply murdered, their deaths recorded as suicides or not recorded at all. Gertrude Seyss-Inquart, already mentally unstable, was placed in a psychiatric facility in Austria. The records are sparse, intentionally so. But she appears to have suffered a complete nervous breakdown. Can you blame her? Her husband was about to be tried for crimes that would make him one of history's most despised figures. Ingeborg, Richard, and Dorothea fled to a small town in the Austrian Alps, hiding under assumed names. They told neighbors their father had died in the war. Just another casualty. Nothing special. They burned photographs. They destroyed letters. They tried to erase any evidence that they were related to Arthur Seyss-Inquart. Richard, the son, faced a particular crisis of identity. He had served in the Wehrmacht. Some sources suggest he had been wounded. He had believed in his father, had believed in the cause. Now he was watching that father stand trial for genocide. In Nuremberg, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. They showed photographs of skeletal children from the Dutch starvation. They presented deportation orders with Seyss-Inquart's signature. They read testimony from survivors who described watching their families torn apart. Seyss-Inquart's defense was chilling in its bureaucratic banality. He claimed he was just following orders. He argued that the deportations were necessary for security reasons. He suggested that the hunger winter was an unfortunate consequence of war, not a deliberate policy. The judges weren't convinced. On October 1, 1946, Arthur Seyss-Inquart was found guilty of war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging. His last words, spoken on the gallows, were in German, "I hope that this execution is the last act of the tragedy of the Second World War, and that the lesson taken from this world war will be that peace and understanding should exist between peoples." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The man who had deliberately starved 20,000 people was pleading for peace and understanding. But what happened next to his 6 people were still lonely in South Carolina. The hospital was free, but did not raise the hospital. The scattered children, after Arthur Seyss-Inquart was executed. His widow Gertrude faced an impossible choice: try to rebuild her life under her real name, or disappear completely. She chose a middle path. She retreated from public life, but kept her name, living quietly in Austria until her death in 1964. She was 58 years old. She never spoke publicly about her husband. She never gave interviews. Those who knew her in her final years described her as a ghost, physically present but psychologically absent, still trapped in the nightmare of what her husband had done. But her children made radically different choices. Ingeborg, the eldest daughter, chose complete erasure. After her father's execution, she changed her surname. Exactly what name she took is not publicly documented, which was precisely the point. She moved with her husband and children to a different part of Austria, possibly Germany. She told her own children almost nothing about their grandfather. Some researchers believe her grandchildren didn't learn about their family connection to Arthur Seyss-Inquart until they were adults, discovering it only through genealogical research or accidental document discoveries. Think about that choice for a moment. Ingeborg decided that the best gift she could give her children was ignorance, to let them grow up unburdened by the knowledge that their grandfather was a mass murderer. Was that mercy or cowardice? Protection or denial? Richard, the son, took a different path, one that's both more tragic and more complicated. After the war, Richard struggled with severe depression and what we would now recognize as PTSD, though the diagnosis didn't exist then. He had served in the German military, had believed in the Nazi cause, and now had to confront the reality that his father was not a patriot, but a war criminal of historic proportions. Some accounts suggest he attempted suicide in the late 1940s or early 1950s, though this cannot be definitively confirmed. What is known is that he withdrew almost completely from society, living in rural Austria and working in jobs far below what his education would have permitted. He married, but the marriage was reportedly troubled and may have ended in divorce. Richard Seyss-Inquart died in the 1970s. The exact date and circumstances remain unclear, which is itself revealing. Even in death, the family sought invisibility. But here's what no one expected. The youngest daughter, Dorothea, made perhaps the most surprising choice of all. The youngest daughter's impossible choice. Dorothea Seyss-Inquart was only 16 years old when her father was arrested, 17 when he was executed. She had spent her entire conscious childhood as the daughter of one of the most powerful Nazis in occupied Europe. Unlike her older siblings, Dorothea had fewer memories of life before the Nazi regime. The Third Reich was essentially all she had ever known. And unlike her siblings, who were adults when their father's crimes were revealed, Dorothea was still forming her identity when the world learned what Arthur Seyss-Inquart had done. What do you do when you're 17 years old and you discover your father is one of history's monsters? Dorothea's response was to vanish. She appears to have left Austria entirely, possibly emigrating to South America or the United States, both common destinations for Austrians trying to escape their Nazi-era associations. She almost certainly changed her name. She may have married under that new identity. And here's the most haunting part. She was remarkably successful at disappearing. Unlike other children of famous Nazis, Albert Speer's children wrote memoirs, Hermann Göring's daughter gave interviews. No one has ever located Dorothea or gotten her to speak publicly about her father. If she's still alive today, she would be 96 years old. It's more likely she died in the 1990s or 2000s, somewhere under a different name, taking her memories of Arthur Seyss-Inquart to the grave. Did she have children? Grandchildren? Are there people walking around today who have no idea they're descended from one of the architects of the Holocaust? The answer is almost certainly yes. The grandchildren and the weight of blood. This raises the most profound and disturbing question of all. What responsibility do descendants bear for their ancestors' crimes? Ingeborg's children and grandchildren, assuming they exist and have been identified, face an impossible situation. Through no fault of their own, they carry the DNA of a man who murdered 100,000 people. They might share his eye color, his height, his mannerisms. Every time they look in the mirror, they might see a shadow of Arthur Seyss-Inquart staring back. Some descendants of Nazi war criminals have spoken about this burden. Katrin Himmler, grandniece of Heinrich Himmler, wrote a book about growing up with that legacy. She described the toxic silence that pervaded her family, the way guilt passed down like a genetic disease, infecting generations who had nothing to do with the original crimes. Nicholas Frank, son of Hans Frank, the Nazi governor-general of Poland, went in the opposite direction. He wrote multiple books condemning his father, calling him a slime, and expressing relief at his execution. He dedicated his life to ensuring the world never forgets what his father did. But Seyss-Inquart's grandchildren have remained silent. We don't even know who they are. This silence raises uncomfortable questions. Is it ethical for researchers to hunt down the descendants of Nazi war criminals? Do they have a right to privacy? Or does history demand their stories? If you discovered tomorrow that you were Arthur Seyss-Inquart's grandchild, what would you do? There's no easy answer. But here's what we know for certain. The Dutch never forgot. While the Seyss-Inquart family was disappearing into obscurity, the Netherlands was building memorials to remember what Arthur Seyss-Inquart had done to them. In Amsterdam, you can visit the Hollandsche Schouwburg, a former theater that the Nazis used as a deportation center. Families were torn apart in that building. Children screamed for their parents. Old people collapsed on the floor, too weak to stand, during the hours-long wait before deportation. More than 60,000 Jews passed through that theater on their way to Auschwitz and Sobibor. Arthur Seyss-Inquart's signature authorized this. In the Western Netherlands, there are monuments to the hunger winter. Plaques mark the spots where people died of starvation in the streets. Museums display the ration cards that entitled Dutch citizens to fewer than 400 calories per day, less than a prisoner in Auschwitz received. Arthur Seyss-Inquart's orders created this suffering. And here's the thing that makes this so viscerally disturbing. While the Dutch were building these memorials, Arthur Seyss-Inquart's grandchildren were probably living normal lives, going to school, falling in love, getting married, having children of their own. They were innocent. They had done nothing wrong, but they carried his blood. They carried his name, even if they changed it. What does that mean? A question of inherited guilt. In Jewish tradition, there's a concept called dor var dor, from generation to generation. It expresses the idea that each generation is responsible for remembering and honoring what came before. But what about the descendants of perpetrators? Are they responsible for remembering and acknowledging what their ancestors did? German society has grappled with this question for decades. There's even a term for it, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past. In Germany, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Nazis have formed support groups to discuss the trauma of inheriting guilt for crimes they didn't commit. Some have embraced radical honesty, publicly acknowledging their ancestry and dedicating themselves to anti-fascist causes. Others have changed their names and disappeared, choosing to protect their own children from the weight of that knowledge. Neither choice is wrong. Neither choice makes the past disappear. The Seyss-Inquart family appears to have chosen silence and disappears. We can judge this choice, but we should also try to understand it. Imagine you're Ingeborg, holding your newborn grandchild in the 1960s or 1970s. Do you tell this innocent baby that her great-grandfather starved 20,000 people to death? What purpose does that knowledge serve? What burden does it place on someone who had no agency, no choice, no connection to those crimes, except the accident of birth? Or imagine you're Richard, struggling with depression and survivor's guilt, knowing that you once believed in your father's cause. Do you have children, knowing they'll inherit not just your genes, but your family's horrific legacy? Or do you choose to end the bloodline, to let the name Seyss-Inquart die with you? These aren't theoretical questions. These are the actual choices Arthur Seyss-Inquart's children had to make. But here's what almost nobody knows. The final reckoning. In 1947, a Dutch survivor of the camps returned to Amsterdam. She had lost her husband, her 2 children, her parents, her siblings, 18 family members in total, all deported under orders signed by Arthur Seyss-Inquart. A journalist asked her if she felt satisfied that Seyss-Inquart had been hanged. Her answer was this: hanging is too quick. He should have been made to watch what we watched. He should have been forced to watch his own children starve to death, the way we watched ours. Then he would understand. This is the dark mirror image of a story we've been telling. While we've been asking what happened to Seyss-Inquart's family, whether they suffered enough, whether they deserve privacy, whether we should judge them, we've also been surrounded by the families of his victims. There are now thousands of Dutch citizens who are the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. They grew up with the trauma their parents carried. They inherited anxiety, depression, and PTSD through mechanisms we're only now beginning to understand through epigenetics. They carry scars from crimes committed by Arthur Seyss-Inquart, scars as real as any physical wound. And unlike Seyss-Inquart's descendants, they cannot hide from their ancestry. Their grandparents' tattoos from Auschwitz, their family trees with branches cut off in 1943, their genetic predisposition to trauma-related disorders, these are permanent markers of what was done to them. So when we ask about the fate of Arthur Seyss-Inquart's family, we need to ask it in the context of this larger truth. His victims' families also carry an inheritance, and theirs is far heavier. The question that remains, today, somewhere in the world, there are probably people who are the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of Arthur Seyss-Inquart. They might not even know it, or they might know and have spent their entire lives hiding it. They are innocent of his crimes. This is important to state clearly. You are not responsible for what your grandfather did. You are not guilty of his sins. But you are responsible for how you respond to that knowledge. Some descendants of Nazis have become historians, educators, anti-fascist activists. They've transformed their family's poisonous legacy into something redemptive, not to erase what was done, but to ensure it never happens again. Others have chosen silence and privacy, and that, too, is a valid choice. No one has the right to force them to become public symbols of inherited guilt. But here's what we cannot do. We cannot forget. We cannot forget what Arthur Seyss-Inquart did. We cannot forget the 107,000 Dutch Jews who died because of his orders. We cannot forget the 20,000 civilians who starved to death during the hunger winter. We cannot forget the thousands of resistance fighters who were tortured and executed under his regime. Their families remember. The Dutch nation remembers. History remembers. And perhaps, in the quiet moments when no one is watching, Arthur Seyss-Inquart's descendants remember too. The question is, what will they do with that memory? What will any of us do when confronted with the darkest parts of our own histories, our own families, our own legacies? That's the question Arthur Seyss-Inquart's family left us. And 78 years after his execution, we still don't have an answer.